Man with no arms was charged with stabbing a tourist using scissors with his feet. John Crenshaw was a well-known figure in South Beach, Florida. With no arms, he would impressively paint pictures with his feet and was once a viral sensation. He was known to be homeless and bragged about impregnating many women, including, he states, Gwen Stefani. In 2018, he was arrested for a shocking incident in Miami Beach. A tourist from Chicago, 22-year-old Cesar Coronado, claimed to have asked John for directions. John claimed that Cesar had punched him in the head. John jumped up, stabbing Cesar with scissors using his feet. Police discovered Cesar bleeding from his arms and he was rushed to hospital. John actually fled the area but was found shortly after close by. He was charged with aggravated battery and had a history of criminal offences. These included disorderly intoxication, vandalism, and battery on police officers.
Imagine having a parcel delivered while you're away, only to get home and find that it's not there. You check your cameras to see who the porch pirate was, and you find this. I cannot cope with this story. It's a really funny one. For once, it's a light-hearted story for my true crime page, which doesn't happen often enough. Omar Munoz was the victim of this crime in Sacramento, and at first he was actually really angry that his parcel had been stolen. It was a new phone charger that he really did need, and he was angry, of course, as you would be, but after checking his video, he could do nothing but laugh at how hilarious that trash bag looks with a pair of slippers poking out. He didn't even report the crime. He just ordered himself a new phone charger, and perhaps this time he'll keep a better lookout for trash bags with feet.
This man won the lottery and then took his own life shortly after. In June 1997, Billy Bob Harrell Jr. became a millionaire overnight after winning the $31 million Texas Lotto jackpot. Billy Jr.'s life before winning was full of financial struggle, and him, his wife, and their 3 children battled every single day to make ends meet. So the lottery win initially changed his family's life. Billy quit his job, took a family trip to Hawaii, and generously donated to his church and helped friends and family. However, his newfound wealth led to a lot of old friends and acquaintances asking him for financial assistance on almost a daily basis. This forced him to change his phone number. Over the course of the next year, his life began to slowly unravel, leading to him separating from his wife. On May 22nd, 1999, just shy of the 2-year anniversary of his big win, Billy Bob Harrell Jr. tragically ended his own life. Billy had expressed his unhappiness to a financial advisor shortly before his passing, telling them, "Winning the lottery is the worst thing that ever happened to me."
This woman killed her roommate over a phone charger. 26-year-old Monica Anderson was living with Lan Lee. Lan was 20 and the 2 women had been introduced through mutual friends. They'd been roommates in Sacramento for around 6 months. Now, Lan had a troubled upbringing and had struggled with addiction to substances. She'd actually been living in a group home for young women but wasn't able to stay once she turned a certain age. She met Monica just after turning 18. On the 13th of March 2010, the pair were drinking alcohol and taking substances. At around 2:30 a.m, they began arguing over a phone charger. Monica, sensing that things were escalating to a dangerous level, tried to run away. Terrifyingly, Lan chased her out of the apartment with a butcher's knife. Lan launched into a vicious attack, stabbing her 91 times. She then tried to stab herself and a friend stopped her. Police raced to the scene and arrested Lan. At the trial, prosecutors stated that Lan murdered Monica over pettiness and ridiculousness. They also played the jurors a video of Lan being questioned by police. In the video, Lan admits that she was simply angry at Monica for not giving her a phone charger. Interestingly, it wasn't the first time that things had got violent between the pair of them. Months prior, Monica actually told her parents that Lan had attacked her and given her a black eye. Lan was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life.
This man was chewing gum when it suddenly exploded, killing him. In December 2009, Vladimir, a 25-year-old chemistry student of Kyiv Polytechnic Institute, was killed when his chewing gum exploded in his mouth. Vladimir had a peculiar habit of dipping his chewing gum in citric acid to enhance its sour taste. On his work table, authorities found about 100 grams of unidentified explosive powder, which he used for his chemistry studies at home. This powder, however, was found to be 4 times stronger than TNT. It is believed that Vladimir accidentally confused the explosive powder with citric acid and coated his gum with it before putting it in his mouth and chewing it. The explosion was possibly triggered by the reaction of the explosive powder with Vladimir's saliva, or the pressure exerted by him chewing on the gum and explosive powder. The explosion resulted in a severe injury that blew out Vladimir's jaw completely. And despite immediate attention from emergency services, they were unable to save him. This is absolutely insane, and just imagine putting a piece of gum in your mouth, and then seconds later your head literally explodes from it. This is one of the most random and brutal deaths I've ever covered, and may Vladimir rest in peace. This is absolutely awful, and what are the odds of this?
The video that I just showed you was taken from the TikTok of Uvalde school shooter Salvador Ramos. Before the school shooting, Salvador displayed tons of red flags all across his online presence, and nobody said anything. And eerily enough, even though the content and profile picture has been deleted, Salvador's account is still up. Now, there were a lot of red flags displayed by this guy before the shooting occurred, including the fact that he was known on online social media platforms as Future School Shooter and School Shooter. But something else disturbing I want to touch on is the presence of Salvador Ramos fan accounts, especially here on TikTok. I find accounts like these to be extremely disgusting and morally reprehensible. And if you don't believe me that people are actually worshipping that demon, just take a look at some of these comments. They'll sicken you to your stomach. And what I'm going to show you next is even more disturbing. Yes, what you just saw was a Salvador Ramos edit, kind of a thirst trap for a school shooter. Now, I don't know why TikTok doesn't ban accounts like these. Not only are they so horrifically offensive to the families of those who lost children and loved ones that day, but they can also be dangerous and possibly even encourage people to commit similar atrocities. So TikTok, I'm calling on you to try to remove some of these accounts that glorify mass killers.
This is why you should never put your feet up on the dashboard of a car. Granny Keeley, an Irish woman, endured a life-changing car crash in 2006 when she was 22 years old at the time. She was the passenger in a car that skidded on black ice and collided with a wall. Granny's knees were then propelled into her face due to her feet being propped up on the dashboard. The impact occurred as the airbag inflated at a staggering speed of 200 miles per hour, resulting in very severe facial injuries. Almost every single bone in her face was broken, and she suffered a brain leak, known as CSF leakage. Additionally, she lost 2 teeth in the traumatic accident. Following the crash, Granine underwent extensive medical procedures. Unfortunately, due to an infection, doctors had to remove her forehead, leaving her without one for 2 years. However, in 2009, surgeons managed to reconstruct her face by fitting her with a ceramic forehead. Granine humorously joked that her new forehead was made in Italy and playfully referred to it as a designer piece. This is Granine today, and she is now 38 years old, and it looks like she didn't even go through this awful experience. But sadly, she still suffers from long-lasting effects from the injury. She said, "I constantly lose my words while in the middle of a conversation. This can happen to me about 20 times a day." She also said, "I get headaches when too many people are talking around, and I sometimes find it difficult to stay focused." So if you learn anything from this video, never ever put your feet on the dashboard of a car that you're in. Because you never know, this can happen to you.
He is now in hell for eternity as a traitor to his country. It is said that those who commit treason and betray others occupy the lowest pits of hell for all time. The federal government of America declared war on America's citizens and the American state.
Seconds earlier in the video I just showed you, this man, Justin Moan, holds his father's severed head wrapped up in plastic and shows it to the camera. That's right, Justin had murdered his father, decapitated him, and was proudly displaying his dad's severed head to the internet. So all of this is coming to light literally this week. This all went down this week. Justin Moan is 32 years old. He's from Pennsylvania. So on Tuesday of this week, Justin's mother at around 7 p.m. discovered the headless body of her husband. This man, Michael Moan, Justin's father. Apparently, Justin was extremely upset because his father was an employee of the federal government. But although we don't know exactly what led up to the murder, we do know that Justin recorded that video where he was holding his father's severed head and then posted it on YouTube. In the YouTube video, which was quickly taken down, called Moan's Militia, he calls for the death of all federal officials of Joe Biden. He slams against Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ rights, and Antifa activists, and he states that he hopes this will send a message. After Justin's mother discovered his father's headless corpse inside of the home, the police knew they had to find Justin. When they found Justin, he was over 100 miles away from the scene of the crime. He had hopped over a gate and was trespassing on a military base. And when they found Justin, he had a loaded weapon on him, although he was arrested without incident, so only God knows what else he was planning on doing. This is just a horrific, sad case. I do not encourage anybody to go look up that footage online. It's truly disgusting and just horrific. And rest in peace, obviously, to Michael Moan.
This might be the craziest and most intense cartel encounter ever. What I'm about to show you is the US Coast Guard raiding a high-speed submarine in the Eastern Pacific Ocean moving more than 17,000 pounds of cocaine. On June 18, 2019, a Coast Guard surveillance aircraft tracked the drug-filled narco sub hundreds of miles off the Colombian and Ecuadorian coastline. And the video shows a member of the Coast Guard riding on top of the speeding sub, pounding on the hatch and demanding it to come to a stop. The video then ends with the presumed trafficker emerging from the narco sub, putting his hands up in surrender. In total, 5 alleged smugglers were seized aboard the vessel. Now, just watch this video. It's absolutely insane, and it's something straight out of a video game.
That's gonna be hard to get on. Alto Barco!
Just a month after this photo was taken, this girl was murdered. Ashley Doolittle was born in Louisville, Colorado. She was only 18 when she was killed. Her mum described how she was always worried about her getting into a car accident or hurting herself while riding horses, but she would never have imagined the tragic fate that met her daughter. Ashley and Tanner Flores had been dating for around a year. Prior to her death, the pair had been arguing a lot more than usual, and Ashley knew that she needed to speak to him about their relationship. They ended up breaking up, but Tanner seemed unable to accept this. On June the 9th, 2016, the pair met at Lon Hagler Reservoir to chat. However, Ashley's mum started to get really worried when her daughter didn't get home that night. Ashley was due to be home at around 7:30, and when she didn't show up, her mum actually went and looked for her. Worryingly, she found Ashley's car but no sign of her daughter. She rang police straight away and reported her missing. Tanner's family reported that they also hadn't been able to contact him since 3:30 that day. Terrifyingly, his dad reported that his gun was missing. Police obviously started a huge search, and a tip came in that led them to Tanner's deceased granddad's house. This was over 300 miles away. When they arrived, they made a grim discovery. Tanner's car was there, covered in blood. Ashley's body was inside, wrapped in blankets. She'd tragically been shot to death. Police managed to track down Tanner shortly after. Now, Tanner eventually admitted to killing the teenager, but insisted that it wasn't premeditated. His defense argued that it was a spur-of-the-moment thing, but why had he taken his dad's gun with him to meet Ashley? When questioned by police, Tanner said, "She just kind of glared at me and turned away, so I grabbed the gun and shot her. She started twitching and freaking out, so I shot her again. I thought it would be an instant thing." He was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
This child was missing since 2019 and has been found alive underneath the staircase. 4-year-old girl named Paisley Schultes was removed from custody of her biological parents along with her sister. Although it has not been revealed on why her parents Kim Cooper and Cole Schultes were no longer legally allowed to look over their own daughters. In July of 2019, Paisley suddenly vanished from her family home while her older sister was at school. She had been living near Ithaca, New York. Although the police strongly suspected her biological parents, they had no proof at all proving this. The police were actually able to search the parents' property, but they denied having anything to do with their daughter's mysterious disappearance. And the police could not find Paisley inside despite thoroughly looking. However, years later in 2022, the police received a tip that Paisley could still be in the house after all, and was being held in a secret hidden location. At first, it seemed nothing was off about the property at all. But after about an hour, one of the detectives noticed something odd about the stairs. And acting on gut instinct, the officer looked a little closer and eventually found a small hiding place. And when they were able to get closer and get a better look, they found Paisley hiding in the little small space. Paisley's parents were then charged with custodial interference and endangering the welfare of a child.
Buenas tardes, para invitarlos a que descarguen la nueva aplicación Ride, una aplicación de transporte.
The man in the TikTok video that I just showed you is Rafael Jesus Diaz. Now, Rafael, before his death, was an infamous Uber driver in the city of Juarez, Mexico. As you know, Juarez has been known for years as one of the most violent cities on earth, with murder rates stemming from cartel violence skyrocketing over the past few decades. Rafael went by Rafa Wayne on TikTok, where he amassed over 75,000 followers before his murder. But in December of 2023, while Rafael was making content and driving for Uber in Juarez, passengers interrupted his live stream and disturbing things followed. Here's the actual video of the live stream.
Dentro, carnal, calmado. Esa puerta no abre. La feria, toda la feria. ¿Cuál feria? Ahí te va. Ahí te va. Aquí lo tengo. Ahí te va. Dame mi pinche teléfono. ¿Cuál teléfono? La contraseña, carnal. Ahí te va.
After that live stream was paused, it never returned, and that's because at the time, Rafael was being murdered by his passengers. You see, in that video, you can hear the passengers asking for Rafael to give them his cell phone and give them his passcode. There was a struggle inside of the vehicle, the live stream ends, and yeah, that's when Rafael was shot and killed. Thankfully, though, the police quickly arrested 3 men and 2 boys who were connected to the murder through the handgun that was used. And apparently, according to the statements of these men, they all began to blame each other when they were questioned about the murder. They were also in possession of crystal meth at the time of their arrest. But this story is crazy because Rafael isn't the first Uber driver to be murdered in Juarez. In fact, in the last couple of months, 4 rideshare drivers have been murdered in Juarez alone. Obviously, there is a problem here and something is going on in the city, and I hope they find some way to address this terrible issue.
You guys remember the Randonautica app and how it led a group of teenagers using it to a suitcase of dismembered human remains? On June 19, 2020, a group of teenagers were using Randonautica, which prompted them to explore a West Seattle beach called Duwamish Head. One of the teens was recording a TikTok video when they stumbled upon a large suitcase that had washed ashore. After opening it with sticks, they found that inside of the suitcase was a garbage bag that had a horrible smell, so they called the police. When police searched the area, they also found a smaller duffel bag, and both bags contained dismembered human remains. After testing, the King County Medical Examiner found that the remains belonged to 35-year-old Jessica Lewis and 27-year-old Austin Winter, a couple who had been dating for 8 years. Authorities concluded that the couple had been beaten before death, and after, Jessica was shot multiple times while Austin was fatally shot once. They were then dismembered, and police believe this happened roughly 10 days earlier on June 9th. During the investigation, authorities found that the couple had been renting a room in a Burien house from 62-year-old Michael Lee Dudley, who had a long history of sexual assault and violent animal cruelty. On the night of the murders, neighbors actually called 911 after hearing gunfire and screaming coming from the home, but when the Burien police responded, nobody answered the door, so they just left. A witness came forward and said that she actually moved into Michael's home on the night of the murders and that Michael actually helped move her things in. But she said that his glasses were broken and that he had scratches all over him. She also said that later that night, she opened the upstairs bedroom door, which is where she was going to be staying, and saw a pile of clothing on the floor with a hand sticking out of it. Michael then reportedly told her that he needed to clean up a mess first and asked if he could take her somewhere else for the night, in which she agreed. But when they were leaving, she saw Michael laying out plastic tarp all over the basement floor. And when she asked him about it, he said, quote, "Let's just put it this way, his gun misfired and mine didn't," end quote. After searching Michael's home and finding bullet holes, blood, and other incriminating evidence, he was arrested. Although he initially denied any involvement in the murders, authorities believe that his motive was over unpaid rent. Michael was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, and I believe sometime this month he will officially be sentenced.
This schoolboy stabbed his teacher to death in front of a classroom full of students. 61-year-old Anne Maguire was a Spanish teacher teaching in Leeds. She'd actually worked at the school for 40 years and she was only 5 months off retirement. However, in April 2014, something absolutely horrific happened. One of her students was 15-year-old Will Cornick. He'd always been described as a smart student who never really caused any trouble. Classmates regarded him as a polite student, but after he got diagnosed with diabetes, his personality seemed to change. In 2013, he tried to join the army, but because of his diagnosis, he was rejected. Being in the army had been his dream, so this was really upsetting for him. After failing to complete his Spanish homework, he was given detention by Anne. He also expressed a wish to her that he wanted to drop Spanish, but she wouldn't let him, which only angered him more. He began to develop a deep-rooted grudge against Anne. Shockingly, he reportedly messaged his friends on Facebook asking if one of them would kill her for him for £10. During one school day, halfway through his Spanish class, Will decided to get up and attack Anne with a knife. The classmates watched on in horror as he chased her out of the classroom. When there, another teacher heard her screams and tried to shield Anne from any more blows from him. Will then allegedly returned to his class and told his classmates how it was a shame that he hadn't killed her. However, Anne did actually pass away from her injuries. Will later admitted that he did plan also to kill 2 other teachers. One of them was actually pregnant at the time. He's been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years.
The Mexican cartel killed this innocent man in a very brutal way, and whatever you do, don't look up the video. The video that I'm about to explain is 42 seconds long, and to make this video even worse than it is, there is a number of sources from Spanish-speaking websites claiming the victim is completely innocent and was possibly just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The clip takes place in the Sonora Desert and it's shot during the day. As you play the video, you see the victim kneeling on the ground with his hands almost in a praying gesture as he pleads for his life, crying. The victim keeps repeating, "Please, please," but the cartel members don't seem to care at all. 3 cartel members surrounding him then grab the victim, and this makes him begin to wail and scream in terror. One of the men grabbing him then uses his free hand and begins to punch the victim multiple times in the face in an attempt to possibly shut him up. Another member holding a machete then kicks the victim in the face, making him faceplant into the ground as his screams get louder and louder. The victim then rolls over in a fetal position in an attempt to protect himself. However, at this point, the man with the machete then takes the blade and swings it hard on the side of the victim's head near where the ear is, and it causes a loud, sickening thud. The victim continues to scream as all this is happening. The man with the machete then strikes the victim again on the side of the head, but this time much harder. You hear the machete chime as it hits the victim's skull, and you also hear a cracking sound. A huge gash then appears on the side of the victim's head that even possibly penetrated the victim's skull. The victim then stops screaming as he is struck another 3 times on the side of the head with the machete. As blood splatters on the desert ground, the cameraman gets closer and you see 4 huge gashes on the side of the victim's head. The gashes are so deep that the machete might have actually cut through the victim's skull. This video is extremely brutal and awful, but the most disturbing part about it is the fear displayed by the captive, and the screams are truly gut-turning. Also, the fact that a lot of people are stating that the victim was an innocent man adds another layer of horror to the video. It's not known what the cartel members accuse the victim of, though it's assumed it's linked to cartel business. Rest in peace to this man. This is absolutely awful, and stuff like this happens way more often than you think.
This man left his 1-year-old son to die in the back of a hot car. He'd previously searched on his phone, animals dying in hot cars. Yet he claimed it was a complete accident and he'd simply forgotten to drop him off at daycare. I feel like that search on his phone and then what happened to his son cannot just be some sort of coincidence. It was June 18th, 2014 in Cobb County, and Justin Harris had taken his 1-year-old son Cooper for breakfast at a cafe, as they did sometimes before daycare. He had then driven straight to work instead of dropping his son off at daycare. He rolled the windows up on the car, went into work, and left his son strapped into his car seat in the back seat. Around 12:30, Justin actually came out of work, got in the car, and went to a Home Depot store where he bought some light bulbs. He claims that he did not see or hear Cooper in the back seat. He drove back to work, went back inside, and carried on with his work as normal. He then came back out at 4:30 and found his son's lifeless body strapped into his car seat. 1-year-old Cooper had died from hypothermia and dehydration. The medical examiner said that Cooper's death would have been slow and torturous. It was 84 degrees and Cooper would have experienced nausea, headaches, dehydration, overheating, seizures, and anxiety. Cooper had scratch marks on his skin where he'd been scratching himself due to the extreme heat. When police searched Justin's phone, they found searches for things like animals dying in hot cars. They also discovered that he'd been texting an underage teenage girl and sending explicit and inappropriate texts, despite being married. The prosecution argued that Justin had left Cooper to die intentionally. He was then free to divorce his wife with zero responsibilities afterwards. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life without parole. He was also given 12 years for felony attempt to commit sexual exploitation of children relating to the explicit texts. However, in June 2022, his murder charge was actually overturned, and 11 months later, the murder and cruelty charges were dropped along with his life sentence. He's still serving his 12 years for the explicit texts, but he is due to be released in just a couple of years.
Began as a normal day in July 2019. That was until locals in a neighbourhood in New South Wales, Australia, entered a real-life horror film. A woman was covered in blood, yelling for people to phone the police. The woman in question was Jessica Camilleri, and the neighbourhood would never be the same again. Jessica was the daughter of Vince and Rita Camilleri, and she had a troubled upbringing. She struggled with various mental health issues, including bipolar and paranoia. She was bullied at school and was eventually removed after an assault. Her behaviour started escalating and she frequently had violent outbursts. Despite her parents getting divorced, her mum Rita remained dedicated to looking after Jessica. In 2018, Jessica was detained in a psychiatric facility after attacking a woman in a doctor's waiting room. She had also attacked several members of her family and random members of the public prior to this. Things got worse while she was in the facility. She ended up attacking a nurse and her mum insisted on discharging her. She said things would be fine and she would look after Jessica at home. The pair actually had a fairly good relationship and they would send each other sweet messages. However, Jessica started to become obsessed with a man that she knew, harassing him with phone calls and threatening him. Rita actually had to take her to the police station to try and scare her into stopping. It worked for a while and the calls died down. Then on July the 20th, 2019, while out walking with her mum, Jessica had an episode of paranoia. Suddenly, she decided that her mum was trying to humiliate her. She escalated into a violent rage and her mum had to try and call the doctor to come and assess her. However, when the doctor arrived at the house, Jessica actually chased him out. As Rita tried to phone for emergency services, Jessica attacked her with 7 knives. She decapitated her mum and dragged her head outside onto the pavement. Covered in blood, she ran to her neighbours' houses, yelling that she'd killed her mum. When police arrived at the scene, Jessica was stood asking if it was possible to bring someone back to life if they didn't have a head. The crime scene was so disturbing that many of the emergency services personnel had to get trauma therapy. In 2020, Jessica was found not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter due to her complex psychiatric illnesses. She was eventually given 16 years in prison.
This sick freak used the username KiwiPedo online and attempted to buy a child from the dark web. Oh yeah, did I mention he's a free man walking out in society right now? Let's talk about this. This is Aaron Hutton from New Zealand. In the year 2014, New Zealand police started tracking an account that went by KiwiPedo on the dark web. And the chats that this user was having with undercover police were disturbing. Aaron had responded to an ad that an undercover officer posted offering a Chinese child for sale for $10,000. Aaron reached out and it seemed like he was deadly serious. During his conversations with the undercover officer, Aaron referenced Joseph Fritzl, the man who imprisoned his own daughter for 24 years in Austria, repeatedly assaulted her, and even had children with her. Aaron referred to Joseph as his hero. And when the undercover officer asked Aaron if having a random Chinese child in his home would raise any suspicion, Aaron, chatting as Kiwi Pedo, responded, "It's called a basement." So eventually Aaron started telling the undercover officer that he would pay up to $15,000 in cash or Bitcoin for a child under 7. And soon afterwards, the authorities were able to pinpoint where his chats were coming from, his workplace, and Aaron was then arrested and his workplace and house were searched. Now, investigators actually found 417 CP or CSAM images and videos on Aaron's devices, which in my opinion is enough to be a life sentence. But after all was said and done, after this man tried to purchase a child under 7 years old on the dark web, after he was found to be in possession of hundreds of CP and CSAM images and videos, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. And to add insult to injury, his 5-year sentence was thrown out and he was resentenced to only 3 years in prison. This happened a few years ago, so that means that he's back out in society right now. Yes, Aaron has already been released. He's already served his full sentence for all of that. And it truly just makes me sick to my stomach that people like this keep getting away with these crimes time and time again. When you're in possession of hundreds of CP or CSAM images, that should be treated as you victimizing hundreds of children. But the government doesn't see it that way for some reason. I don't understand why. And yeah, he's back out. If you want to hear more true crime stories, be sure to listen to my wife and I's podcast, Murder in America, available on all streaming platforms.
What this father did to his daughter is sickening, and it was caught on camera. Alicia Mesti was 14 years old. A year prior to her going missing, her dad, Mark, who lived in California, was given custody of her and her brother. The courts had determined that their mum, Roberta Allen, was unfit to be a parent. However, worryingly, Mark had a criminal record. He'd previously been charged with drunk driving, bank fraud, and DV. He'd also been ordered to attend anger management groups. He even spent some time in prison due to substances and violating probation. It's actually shocking that he was given custody of these children. On the 14th of August 2006, Mark's girlfriend Shelley Walker was in town. She got a flight from LA to go and visit Mark. Now, she was intending on picking up Alicia from a relative's house in San Jose on her way from the airport, but Mark actually called her and said that she wouldn't need to. When Shelley asked, Mark explained that Alicia had run away. Shelley was obviously concerned by this and reported her missing. Police believed Mark's story and found no evidence of foul play. When Mark was evicted from his home in December, he actually moved to LA to be with Shelley. 3 years passed with no sign of Alicia, and Mark was strangely unbothered. Then in 2009, a huge development. Police took cadaver dogs to Mark's old house. Shockingly, they uncovered human remains. They were then identified as the missing child. Investigators immediately turned up at Mark's house, and what they found there was shocking. It turned out Mark was cooking M at his house with Shelley. Shockingly, there were children living there while this was going on. They were charged relating to substances and child endangerment. An autopsy showed that Alicia died of a huge amount of substance intoxication. The reason for this is hideous. Prosecutors stated that Mark had D'd his daughter in order to R her. Disgustingly, there were over 1,000 CSA images on Mark's computer, and horrifically 54 including himself and Alicia while she was unconscious. Mark was also accused of SAing an 8-year-old girl who lived in his apartment and a teenager that he had groomed. The jury was shown a video of Mark sickeningly setting up a hidden camera in the 8-year-old victim's bedroom. He went on to plead guilty and was eventually sentenced to life in prison.
However, coined the phrase, "You can't make this stuff up," might have known the story of real-life boogeyman, Albert Fish. A slight, elderly man with grey hair, no one suspected the kindly single father of being sadistic child murderer and cannibal.
This is one of the most disturbing cases that I've ever heard of, and it could have been prevented. This is 17-year-old Georgia Williams. On May 26, 2013, she was brutally murdered by a man who claimed to be her friend, but in reality, he was a predator who was obsessed with snuff films. The friend in question was 23-year-old Jamie Reynolds. That night, at around 8 p.m., Jamie asked Georgia to come over to his house in Telford, Shropshire, because he needed help with a photography project. It wasn't a secret that Jamie wanted to become a photographer, and he had even previously taken photos of Georgia's friends. She felt that it was a little awkward that he asked because he had already asked her out multiple times in the past in which she politely declined. But on that night, she agreed to walk to his house to pose for a few photos, and that would be the last time that she was ever seen alive. Georgia was reported missing the next day after failing to return home, and police immediately went to Jamie's house. Neither Georgia or Jamie were there, but what they did find is extremely chilling. Authorities found a digital camera containing horrific images of Georgia standing on a box with a rope around her neck. Once there, Jamie kicked the box out from underneath her and filmed and took photos of her final moments struggling to breathe. Once she was dead, Jamie sexually assaulted her body before dumping her in the woods. It would then take 2 weeks for authorities to locate her body. Jamie was quickly arrested, and what police found at his house is horrifying. Authorities found a list with the names of 32 girls that he knew that were all possible targets. They also found a series of stories about killing girls in which he planned to reenact. Most chilling of all, though, is a story that police found titled Georgia's Surprise, in which he detailed all of the horrific things that he did to her. What's infuriating is that this could have all been prevented. Jamie had an extensive criminal history dating all the way back to his teen years. He was known to be extremely creepy towards women from a young age and owned a large collection of snuff films, which showed women being murdered. He would even go on to tell police that he was turned on by strangulation. He was first arrested as a teenager, and a doctor determined that he was a significant risk to others, but nothing was done. He was arrested once more for trying to strangle a girl, but again, he was released. Jamie would also Photoshop pictures of girls he knew to show them being hanged, and his dad even reported this to the police, but they didn't take any action, and they never informed any of the girls in the photos of what Jamie was secretly doing. Jamie was also arrested in 2011 for hitting a girl with his car after she rejected him, yet police let him off with a traffic warning. All of this combined should have been enough for police to know that he would escalate, yet it seems like they really just didn't care. What's incredibly sad is that Georgia's dad was a detective with the West Mercia Police, but he retired after she was killed. Her parents have gone on to say that they still have nightmares to this day over what happened to their daughter.
Mysterious case absolutely does not sit right with me. Someone knows something and has not come forward. On the 12th of July 2015, 18-year-old Tiffany and her parents attended a graduation party in New Jersey. At around 9 p.m, one of Tiffany's friends spoke to her parents and claimed that they were really annoyed because Tiffany had used their debit card without permission. Tiffany initially denied this to her friend, but then did admit this to her mum Diane a little bit later. At this point, they were all outside Tiffany's house, and Diane went inside to find her husband. When she returned outside of the house, Tiffany had vanished. Now, they were able to see Tiffany on the deer cameras that they had outside the house. She appears to be walking down the driveway in her normal clothing and white headband. When they tried to find Tiffany, they actually made a terrifying discovery. Her phone was lying on the floor at the bottom of the driveway. Immediately, they knew something was wrong, as Tiffany never had her phone out of her sight. At 11:30 p.m, her family called the police. Little did they know, 27 minutes earlier, Tiffany had been hit by a train. Frustratingly, pretty much straight away, police presumed this death to be a self-unaliving. However, that just didn't seem to fit with the evidence presented. All of Tiffany's family and friends said how much of an upbeat person she was and that she was really happy at the time. She was making plans for the future, and the autopsy also showed that she had a clean toxicology report. Now, in the deer cam footage, she was fully clothed, but when she was found, she was just in her underwear with no shoes on. Upsettingly, 2 weeks after her death, Tiffany's mum actually found her missing trainers and headband more than a mile away from the tracks. Could someone have murdered Tiffany and then dumped her body on the train tracks to make it look like she did this herself? Tiffany's parents certainly think so. They definitely suspect some foul play was involved.
This is Jimmy Savile, one of the worst pedophiles in world history. And let me warn you, this is a really disturbing story, so viewer discretion is advised. Jimmy Savile was an English DJ, radio and television personality, and a very, very famous entertainer. Jimmy came from practically nothing and became a superstar in England. When he was younger, during World War II, he worked in coal mines, but he eventually started wrestling and then DJing, and that's where he really rose to fame. Now, people in England loved Jimmy Savile. During his illustrious career, he was knighted by the Queen herself, and he was known to be great friends with the royal family. He also hosted a number of huge British television shows like Top of the Pops, and he had his own kids show called Jim Will Fix It. And when Jimmy died in 2011, the country of England mourned him. They were really sad to see him go, but that's also when all of these accusations came out. And soon people knew the truth about Jimmy Savile, and he was not a good guy. When Jimmy was alive, he was known to be charitable, and he worked at hospitals and volunteered his time helping with sick kids and young adults. But this is how he got access to his victims, by acting like the nice guy. And in his time on Earth, Jimmy Savile sexually abused over 400 kids and young adults. He would literally seek out children in their weakest states when they were in the hospital recovering from operations, and that's when he would abuse them. But something that I find extremely disturbing about this whole story is that everybody around Jimmy Savile knew that he was a pedophile, but no one was reporting it. In the hospitals that he volunteered at, nurses would literally tell the children to act like they were asleep when Jimmy was around because they feared what he would do to them. Friends of Jimmy's would make jokes about him being a pedophile in their comedy routines. Even powerful people at the BBC knew that Jimmy Savile was sexually assaulting children, hundreds of children, but they did nothing. You see, he was worth too much. He was too valuable to them. And they needed him to make as much money for them as possible. One particularly gruesome and sick thing that emerged about Jimmy Savile after he died was that he used to go to the morgue in these hospitals, and he would actually have sex with dead bodies. He would also move the bodies around in the morgue, pose them, and take photos of them, laughing while he was doing this. And one nurse even reported watching Jimmy Savile wheel around the dead body of a 4-year-old child in a stroller. Yeah, this guy was incredibly twisted, and he affected so many people's lives. And another sad part of this story is that Jimmy Savile never really had to face any sort of repercussions for his actions while he was alive. When he died as a beloved public figure, somebody that people looked up to and adored. But behind closed doors, Jimmy Savile was a sexual deviant, a pedophile, and just a horrible human being. There is so much to this story. I'm telling you, I couldn't even cover this whole story in 10 TikToks, but if you want me to go into more details about all this, let me know and I'll post a part 2. Because this is literally only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Jimmy Savile and some of the horrible and atrocious things that he did while he was alive.
Imagine being invited over for a study session only to be murdered and eaten by another student. This man literally killed and ate a human and never spent any time in jail. It was the 11th of June 1981 in Paris. Issei Sagawa was a Japanese man studying in France. On the day in question, he invited a fellow student round to help him translate poetry for an assignment. The student was Dutch woman Renee Hartveld. She had no idea he had sinister plans for her. She also wasn't aware of his dark and depraved past. He planned to kill and eat her, and his reasoning was that he felt that he was weak and ugly. She, on the other hand, was very healthy and beautiful. He thought if he ate her, he would take on her characteristics. When she showed up, he shot her in the neck. Horrifically, he then arred her body and tried to eat her, but realized his teeth weren't sharp enough. He decided to go out and come back with a sharp knife. Upon arrival back at the house, he ate part of her face, bum, feet, and neck. He then saved some of her body parts in his fridge. Now, as time went on, the rest of her body started to decompose. He panicked and took the rest of her remains over to a lake. Luckily, he was caught doing so and was found to have 2 suitcases with him filled with body parts. Now, this should have been the end of the tale, and he should have gone to prison and served a lot of time for this hideous crime. It turned out, as a child, he'd experienced cannibalistic desires. When he was 24, he'd stalked a woman and followed her back to her apartment. He then broke in as she slept. Now, she actually woke up and fought back. He was arrested and charged with R, but actually had a wealthy dad who just paid off the victim. A few years later, in 1977, he went to study in Paris. He claimed he would often bring home S-workers and intend to kill them, but just would freeze up. Now again, due to his wealthy family, when he got arrested for the horrific cannibal murder, he was able to afford a good lawyer. He was found legally insane and unfit to stand trial. He was then placed in a mental hospital for an unspecified amount of time. However, his case then started getting widespread media attention, and he was actually deported back to Japan. It was in Japan he was declared sane. Now, the charges in France had been dropped, and he was released from hospital in 1986 and then was a free man. This was obviously heavily criticised by so many people. Staggeringly, he remained free until 2022, when he passed away from pneumonia in Tokyo, aged 73.
This man is the worst pedophile in the history of South Korea. And let me warn you now, the story's really gonna piss you off. We're gonna be covering some extremely graphic and unsettling details in this TikTok, so listener discretion is advised. So this is Chu Do-soon. He was born October 18th, 1952, and he started his life of crime early. He committed his first crime in 1970, and was let off because he was young. Then in 1977, he was sentenced to 8 months in prison for habitual theft. In 1983, at age 31, he assaulted a 19-year-old girl who worked near where he lived. After the assault, the woman needed 30 days to recover, and Chu Do-soon was only sentenced to 3 years in prison for this crime. Then in the year 1995, after being released from prison, while he was drunk, Chu Do-soon assaulted and beat a man to death. This was all because the man in the bar was praising a controversial president at the time. The court system in South Korea deemed Chu Do-soon as having a feeble mind, and they gave him 2 years imprisonment. Keep in mind, for a majority of this crime spree, he's married, and his wife actually praises him. She said that he cooks well, he cleans the house, and 11 out of his 18 crimes were committed while he was married. But now we get to December 11th, 2008. Keep in mind, in the past, this man has already murdered someone and assaulted a girl so badly she had to be treated for 30 days. On that day, an 8-year-old elementary student was on her way to school. Her name was Kim. And on that day, Chu Do-soon, who was 56 and hammered drunk, kidnapped her. He then told the girl he had to go to church, so he dragged her into a church's bathroom. While in the bathroom, he then started beating her. He violently bit the girl on her cheek, and he then strangled and held the 8-year-old girl's head underwater until she passed out. While she was passed out, he then brutally assaulted the 8-year-old girl. Afterwards, he left the young girl on the floor with the cold water running and fled the scene. Kim was saved. Thankfully, she survived this incident, but she had to be treated for 8 months to deal with her injuries. I can't imagine the horrors that this young girl went through. Thankfully, though, like I said before, she survived this entire ordeal. This guy left evidence at the scene and still had the young girl's blood on him when he was eventually arrested. Now, Chu Do-soon was initially sentenced to life in prison, which he definitely deserved. He deserves more if you ask me. But after the young girl testified that he smelled like alcohol during the assault, his sentence was reduced to 12 years in prison. That's because the South Korean courts deemed that he was not in a sound mind when he committed the crime. So he already assaulted a 19-year-old girl, he murdered someone, and he brutally assaulted an 8-year-old girl almost to death. There's a whole lot more we could cover about the trial itself and how the prosecution completely disrespected the young victim herself. But yeah, in the year 2020, he was released from prison and he's a free man today. In fact, after his release from prison, he moved back in with his wife, and the couple live only about a kilometer away from the house of the victim. Kim, the victim's father, even stated he would raise money to try get Cho to leave, but that hasn't happened yet. Kim, the victim, was left with permanent damage to her abdomen and was told she'll be disabled for life. And according to a report from her father in 2020, nowadays all she does is sit at home and watch cartoons, and avoids the news completely so she doesn't see anything related to assault. But yeah, people were pissed in South Korea when this guy was released. There were huge riots, but it didn't do anything. And he's out there living his free life. What it did do, though, is cost taxpayer money. In fact, in the first 4 months after Chu Do-soon was released, the government installed 72 new security cameras in the town he was in, and introduced all sorts of security measures just to track this guy and make sure he doesn't reoffend. And this government security has cost over $150,000 US. I can think of a simpler solution to eradicate the problem that is this horrible man, but we can talk about that another time.
This is the unlikely reason that a trip to Taco Bell ended in murder. It was 2003 in Illinois. Sarah Kolb and Corey Gregory met after being enrolled in a GED program together. They quickly became inseparable as friends. However, Corey was known to have grown romantic feelings for Sarah, but unfortunately for Corey, Sarah was a lesbian and did not feel the same way about him. Sarah was known for being an alpha female in her friendship circle, and she started hanging out with a group called the Juggalos, who I found out are fans of the hip-hop group Insane Clown Posse. The group is stereotyped as being violent and crime committing, and in 2011, the FBI would go on to officially label them as a gang. In November 2004, a girl called Adrienne Reynolds moved to East Moline to live with her dad. She was enrolled in the same program as Sarah and Corey and quickly caught Sarah's eye. It's reported that Sarah made her feelings known for Adrienne and the pair began flirting. This went on for a matter of weeks, with the pair writing romantic letters to each other when they eventually decided to meet out of school. The pair ended up going to a party together, and it's believed that Sarah had expectations of how the relationship was going to develop, but it actually all ended up going horribly wrong. She was blindsided when Adrienne left the party and returned a few hours later. Adrienne told Sarah that she had slept with 2 guys. At this point, Sarah decided to cut things off with Adrienne, but Adrienne wanted the relationship to continue. She wasn't ready to go down without a fight. Over a period of 2 months, Adrienne relentlessly pursued Sarah for another chance. Sarah actually even ended up making threats to Adrienne if she didn't leave her alone. Now, Adrienne at this point decided to develop a relationship with Corey, and she started writing letters to him. Ultimately, Sarah ended up finding out about these letters to Corey, and she was enraged. On the 21st of January 2005, Sarah invited Adrienne for lunch. Adrienne was pleased, under the impression that they could all maybe finally get along. Unfortunately, she couldn't have been more wrong. After meeting up at Taco Bell, Sarah confronted Adrienne about writing the letters to Corey. A huge fight broke out in the car park of the restaurant. Corey ended up intervening, and he actually held Adrienne down while Sarah strangled her to death. The pair then took Adrienne's body to Sarah's grandparents' farm, where they tried to burn her with petrol. When that failed, they called a friend of theirs, 16-year-old Nathan, to come and help them. He used his granddad's handsaw to dismember her body and put her body parts in a bin bag. The trio then disposed of her remains at Black Hawk Historical Site in Rock Island. Adrienne's parents started to get really worried when she didn't turn up for work, and they reported her missing. Her remains were discovered by police on the 26th of January. Sarah and Corey were charged as adults with 2 counts of first-degree murder and concealment of homicide. Nathan was also charged with concealment of a homicide. Sarah was found guilty and was sentenced to 53 years in prison. Corey was sentenced to 45 years in prison after pleading guilty. Nathan was given a juvenile sentence of 5 years, and he actually died a few years after his release in a car accident.
This is Peter Scully, one of the worst pedophiles in world history. I'm about to tell you his story, but seriously guys, this one is incredibly disturbing. It's so dark, and viewer discretion is really advised for this video. So Peter Scully, he's still alive. He was from Australia, he had a family there, but he was engaging in criminal activities, and he eventually fled the country and moved to the Philippines. And this is where the darkness really began. While he was in Australia, Peter Scully started up an international child sex abuse ring. The things that were done to these kids are, I mean, I can't even talk about them here on TikTok, but he also started up a pay-per-view video service. And with these videos, he was producing CP, but one of the most extreme forms of CP that can possibly be produced. So how did all this happen? Well, when he was out living in the Philippines, Peter Scully had 2 Filipina girlfriends. They would go out to the streets, they would find kids that needed money or looked impoverished, they would bring them back to the house they shared with Peter, and the things that went on afterwards are literally unspeakable. Remember, like I mentioned before, Peter was the head of an international ring of people that enjoyed the abuse of kids, and he provided videos for these clients. But his most infamous video was titled Daisy's Destruction. This video that he produced was so extreme, so hardcore, that people on the internet, when they heard about what happened in the video, literally thought that it was an urban legend, and they thought that there was no way this could be real. This is an actual screenshot of the beginning of the video. This is a screenshot from the very beginning of the video. In the video, 3 young girls are repeatedly tortured for hours and hours on end by Peter Scully and his 2 girlfriends from the Philippines. They are beaten, they are sexually abused. I mean, I can't even describe, like I said on TikTok, some of the things that happened in this video. And 18-month-old Daisy. Now, keep in mind that all of this was on camera. That's the most disturbing part of this. One of Peter's victims actually ended up dying. They were buried in his house. And this sick individual literally sold that video footage across the world. And what's even more disturbing is that there were lots of people willing to pay to see that video. I'm not kidding. People were paying $10,000 to view this video. That is absolute insanity that there are people that sick out there in the world. And this is only the beginning of the crimes that this guy carried out. Some of the other stuff that we're going to touch on is absolutely disgusting. It's just horrific. And the story of how Peter Scully was eventually identified and arrested is extremely captivating. I'm going to run out of time here on this video, but if you want to see a part 2, let me know below. The story is far from over.
This is the disturbing case of the child who killed a child. In July 2018, 6-year-old Alicia McPhail was abducted from her bed. She'd been staying with her grandparents in the Isle of Bute. She'd gone to sleep watching Peppa Pig, and no one had any idea of the horrors that would unfold that evening. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Aaron Campbell was drinking with friends at his house. Aaron apparently became upset in the night because he had been arguing with his mum. He had had a challenging upbringing involving physical and emotional abuse. Aaron decided that evening he wanted to get some substances to smoke from a couple that he knew. The couple in question were Alicia's dad, Robert, and his girlfriend. They'd been known to sell substances to Aaron previously, but he could not get hold of them. Intending to go and steal them off them, Aaron armed himself with a knife. He headed to Robert's house where he lived with his parents and girlfriend. This was obviously where Alicia was staying that evening. When he arrived at the house, he noticed the 6-year-old sleeping in her bed and took the opportunity to snatch the poor defenseless young child. Disgustingly, he carried her to a secluded location, SA'd her, and then killed her. He then disposed of his clothes in the sea. At 6 a.m. the next day, Alicia's grandparents woke up to discover that the little girl was missing. They straight away alerted police and locals. When the family asked Aaron to keep an eye out for the little girl, he texted them back saying, "Oh damn, I'm sure she's not went too far." A local man soon discovered Alicia's lifeless body around 15 minutes away from her house. Along with a lot of the local community, Aaron's mum actually checked her CCTV of her house. She was hoping that this would help with the investigation, and it definitely did. She saw her son leaving and returning from the house that night, and she handed the evidence over to police. Aaron was arrested, and it was discovered that the clothes that he'd abandoned on the beach did actually match with his DNA.
John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, did not act alone. This TikTok series is about to blow your mind, but there's a lot of information here, so proceed with caution. The case of John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer clown, is one of the most infamous true crime stories in American history. A brief overview of the case: in the 1970s, John Wayne Gacy murdered 33 young men. He buried them in the crawl space beneath his home and his yard, and he was connected to a number of different crimes. Gacy himself gained infamy because he dressed up as Pogo the Clown on the weekends and volunteered at hospitals and children's birthday parties. Now, the official story says that John Wayne Gacy acted completely alone. He had no help in carrying out any of these murders, but I really don't believe that that's the case. Through all of our research that we did for our podcast, we've determined that Gacy was connected to a number of other killers, pedophiles across America. And he even may have been connected to one of America's other most infamous serial killers, the Candyman out of Houston, Texas. So before we get into this, I want to state that I do believe that Gacy did murder some people, and I think he was very complicit in all of this, obviously, but I don't think that he acted alone. But why do I think that? So to start off, we need to talk about Jeffrey Rignall, this guy who was actually a survivor of John Wayne Gacy. After a night of abuse and SA at the hands of John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Rignall was allowed to go free. But what Jeffrey would go on to tell authorities and the media about what happened that night at Gacy's home is a major thing in this whole conspiracy. Now, Jeffrey would tell the police that while Gacy was SAing him, there was another man in the room. Now, whether or not this other man participated in the SAing or they were there to watch, it doesn't matter. Someone was watching this criminal act occur. He knew he could give a description of the guy, and he knew that someone else was there watching this happen. Then we get to Robert Bob Gilroy, who was a victim of John Wayne Gacy. So Robert Gilroy was abducted on September 15th, 1977. That's the official date that he went missing. He was supposed to show up for an event after that day, but he never showed. But John Wayne Gacy's plane tickets and records placed him as being out of the state at the time. His plane tickets from the time show that Gacy left Illinois on September 12th, and he didn't return until September 16th, the day after Robert Gilroy went missing. Already, these two facts point to a larger conspiracy at hand. There may have been people helping procure victims for Gacy, and he may have been even paying for these victims. And that's when we get to Philip Paskey and John David Norman, two of the most horrific people I've ever read about. And this is where the connections with the case start to get really shocking. And we've talked about John David Norman here on my TikTok before. This guy was connected with the higher ups in the government. This guy had lots of political power, and he was a known pedophile. Remember, in earlier TikToks, I even told you about how John David Norman was arrested multiple times. He had Rolodexes full of index cards of the people who he was supplying these young men to. And both times, the police departments lost the Rolodexes and lost all the names of the abusers. But how did they connect to Gacy? Well, in part 2, we're going to talk about it.
This case made me terrified to go to the cinema. This is the case of the horror in Screen 9. James Holmes was raised in California. His mum was a nurse and his dad was a scientist. From a young age, he was experiencing night terrors and allegedly actually tried to take his own life when he was just 11 years old. He was apparently obsessed with guns and weapons and had dreamed of becoming a mass murderer. Between May and July 2012, he legally bought 4 guns. Background checks were conducted and he was allowed the weapons. He also bought spike strips, which, if you don't know, pop the tyres of cars if they chase after you. On July the 19th, just hours before tragedy would unfold, James mailed his notebook to his psychiatrist. Inside the notebook, James detailed his plans to kill. The notebook was actually discovered later on undelivered. Just prior to entering a cinema in Aurora, James rang a crisis line to tell them about his plans to kill. However, the call was disconnected after just 9 seconds. At the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises, CCTV captures James walking into the cinema. He walks into Screen 9, props open the door, and then walks back out again. Shockingly, he goes to his car and gets guns out and gas canisters. He re-entered the screen at about 12:38 PM and set off 2 gas canisters. When he entered Screen 9 again, he immediately opens fire on the audience, instantly killing 10 people. 2 others later died in hospital from their injuries. An additional 70 people were injured. This was an absolutely packed out cinema. James also shot at people as they scrambled to exit the screen. His youngest victim was a 6-year-old girl. Witnesses said this all unfolded as there was actually a gunfight on the screen, and initially they all thought it was special effects and just part of the film. Police were actually on the scene very quickly after the first 911 call. James surrendered to the police and was arrested in the car park. He was apparently very calm when he was arrested and told police that he had booby-trapped his apartment. When police investigated his apartment, this was found out to be true. He was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences.